The sound of the grocery store doors sliding open marked the beginning of another uneventful Thursday. Margaret pushed her cart into the store, her list tucked neatly in her purse, though she knew it by heart. Milk, eggs, bread, simple essentials for a life that had become as predictable as the aisles she roamed weekly. At 54, Margaret had grown used to the silence of her empty nest and the quietness of her evenings. Her children were grown, her marriage long dissolved. Her days were filled with work and errands, her nights with books and a glass of wine. It wasn't unhappy, but it wasn't full either. She stood in the produce section, examining apples with the same practiced care she gave to everything in her life. It was then she noticed him. He was reaching for a bag of oranges, his sleeves rolled up to reveal strong, sun-kissed arms. Margaret couldn't help but glance. His youth stood out like a splash of color in the sea of monotony. She caught his eye when he turned, a warm smile spreading across his face as he said, "They're never quite as sweet as they look, are they?" It was such a small thing, a comment about fruit, but it startled something in her, a flutter she hadn't felt in years. She smiled back, laughing softly. "I suppose it's always a gamble." He lingered for a moment, and in that span, she felt something shift. It wasn't the words exchanged. It was the ease of it, the lightness. He introduced himself as Daniel, a name she found herself repeating in her mind as they talked briefly about the unseasonal weather and their shared disappointment in the store's selection of oranges. As she wheeled her cart away, she caught herself smiling. A small, unfamiliar warmth bloomed in her chest. It was silly, she thought, but as she turned into the next aisle, she couldn't shake the feeling that she'd walked through a doorway she didn't know existed. That night, as Margaret prepared her solitary dinner, her mind drifted back to the grocery store. She couldn't remember the last time someone had made her feel seen, even if it had been for only a few moments. It was nothing, she told herself, a passing encounter, but deep down she hoped she might see him again. She didn't know it yet, but the spark in aisle 7 was only the beginning. The next week, Margaret found herself lingering in the grocery store longer than usual, her errands unfolding at a leisurely pace. She scolded herself for it. Surely she wasn't hoping to see him again. Yet, as she rounded the corner near the produce section, there he was, scanning the avocados with the same thoughtful expression she had admired before. "Still gambling on fruit," she said, surprising even herself with her playful tone. Daniel looked up, his face brightening instantly. "You caught me. Still no luck?" He straightened, holding up an avocado. "Tell me, how does one pick a good one? I could use an expert opinion." Margaret laughed, stepping closer. "The trick is to gently press the top. If it gives just a little, it's ripe. But too soft, and it's already past its prime." She handed him one she had tested herself. He studied the fruit like she'd handed him treasure. "I'll trust your judgment," he said with a grin. They ended up chatting by the display for far longer than expected. Margaret learned he was 31, a freelance graphic designer who had recently moved back to town to help his mother recover from surgery. He spoke with such warmth about family, his words underscored by a sincerity that Margaret found refreshing. For her part, Margaret shared bits of herself she usually kept tucked away, her children, her love of gardening, her quiet evenings spent reading. She surprised herself with how easily the words came. Daniel listened intently, his eyes never straying from hers, and she couldn't help but notice how present he seemed, a rare quality, she thought. Their conversation flowed so naturally that Margaret hardly noticed how much time had passed. It wasn't until another shopper squeezed past them with an impatient cough that they realized they had been blocking the aisle. "Sorry about that," Daniel said with an apologetic chuckle. "I tend to lose track of time when I'm enjoying myself." Margaret felt her cheeks warm. "I suppose I should finish my shopping before I buy out the store." "Same here," he replied, but before they parted ways he added, "Hey, if you're ever in the mood for a good coffee, there's a cafe downtown I think you'd like. Maybe we could meet there sometime." Her heart skipped. It was casual, an offer of friendship, but the sincerity in his voice made it feel like more. She hesitated, not out of disinterest but from an unfamiliar shyness. "That sounds lovely," she said finally. They exchanged numbers before walking in opposite directions, but the lightness in Margaret's step stayed with her long after she left the store. That evening, as she arranged flowers in a vase, she found herself smiling again, a small flicker of joy she hadn't expected. The connection with Daniel felt effortless, refreshing. And though she told herself it was just a budding friendship, her heart whispered that it could be something more. Margaret didn't expect the text to come so quickly. The next day, her phone buzzed with a message from Daniel. "Good morning, Margaret. Just wanted to say I hope your day is as kind to you as you were to me yesterday. Also, the avocado was perfect. Thanks for the tip." She read the text twice, her lips curving into a smile she couldn't suppress. A polite thank you would have sufficed, but his words carried warmth, a brightness that made her feel seen. Over the following weeks, their connection grew in ways Margaret hadn't anticipated. Their casual coffee meetups became a ritual, punctuated by long conversations that seemed to touch every corner of life. Daniel had an easy charm that drew people in, but with her, he seemed to offer something deeper, a genuine interest in her thoughts, her past, her quiet dreams. He asked about her favorite books, listened as she recounted childhood memories, and even teased her about her self-professed obsession with tea over coffee. "It's not an obsession," she protested one afternoon at the cafe, cradling her Earl Grey. "Margaret, you've listed at least 5 different kinds of tea you keep at home," he said with a playful smirk. "If that's not obsession, what is it?" She laughed, swatting his arm. The ease of their banter felt like slipping into a soft, well-worn sweater. But it wasn't just the laughter. It was the way he listened when she spoke of her late husband, his presence steady and unintrusive. It was how he remembered the little things she mentioned, the books she wanted to read, her favorite flowers, and wove them into their conversations as if they mattered. And it was the way her heart began to flutter when she saw his name light up her phone. The realization came quietly at first, slipping in like the dusk that softened the edges of her days. She found herself thinking about Daniel more often, wondering how he was if he thought of her too. The tenderness in his smile lingered in her mind long after their conversations ended. One evening, as she prepared dinner, she paused, her hand stilling over the cutting board. It hit her with startling clarity. Her feelings for Daniel were no longer just friendly. A wave of panic followed, sharp and insistent. "This can't be right," she thought, her breath catching. "He's young. He's full of life and possibilities, and I'm me." She looked at her reflection in the window, her face softened by the fading light. 53. The number echoed in her mind, heavy with everything it represented. Her years of experience, the lines of her past etched into her skin. Her heart wrestled with her logic, shame mingling with hope in a dizzying spiral. The feelings were undeniable, but what could they possibly mean? Was she foolish to let them grow, to believe for even a moment that Daniel might feel the same? She spent that night restless, turning over every possibility, every reason to suppress the hope blooming in her chest. Yet in the quiet hours before dawn, one thought lingered. It wasn't just his youth or his charm that had drawn her to him. It was the way he made her feel alive again, as if the world still held surprises and joys waiting to be discovered. For the first time in years, Margaret felt the stirring of something she had thought long gone, desire, not just for connection, but for the courage to embrace it. Margaret spent the following days walking a tightrope of emotions. Every time her phone buzzed with a message from Daniel, a rush of warmth filled her chest, but it was quickly chased by doubt. She replayed their conversations, searching for hidden meanings, wondering if she was misreading the signals. In the quiet moments, when she was alone with her thoughts, the weight of societal judgment pressed down on her. A voice in her mind whispered harsh truths. What will people think? A woman in her 50s and a man barely in his 30s? They'll call you desperate, foolish, embarrassing. She scolded herself for letting these feelings take root. He was kind, attentive, and genuine, but surely that didn't mean he felt the same way. Maybe he just saw her as a friend, a mentor of sorts, someone to confide in. Still, there were moments that made her wonder. One afternoon, as they strolled through the park after their usual coffee, Daniel turned to her and said, "You know, Margaret, talking to you feels different. I mean, it's easy with my friends. We joke around, keep things light, but with you? I don't know. I feel like I can just be myself. It's rare." His words lingered in the air like a melody she couldn't forget. Margaret's chest tightened. She wanted to ask what he meant, to probe the boundaries of this connection they had formed. But fear kept her silent. Instead, she smiled and deflected with a light-hearted quip, masking the torrent of emotions beneath. The turmoil grew stronger with each passing day. She began to notice how his laughter made her heart quicken, how his presence softened the edges of her loneliness. And when he touched her arm in a casual, friendly gesture, her skin seemed to hum with a warmth that lingered long after. But alongside the exhilaration was the ever-present voice of doubt. This is dangerous territory. What if you ruin the friendship? What if he pulls away, embarrassed or uncomfortable? Margaret sought solace in her journal, pouring her conflicted feelings onto the pages late at night. She wrote about the joy he had brought into her life, the way he made her feel seen in a way she hadn't felt in years. And she wrote about the fear of rejection, of judgment, of allowing herself to hope for something she wasn't sure she deserved. One entry stood out, scrawled in a moment of vulnerability. I don't know if I can risk it, but maybe the bigger risk is letting this slip away. If he's the spark I've been waiting for, don't I owe it to myself to see where it leads? The next morning, as she reread those words, a sense of resolve began to form. It wasn't complete, not yet. It was more like the first flicker of a match in the darkness. But it was enough to plant a seed of courage. For now, she decided she would take it one step at a time. Whatever lay ahead, she would let her heart guide her. The decision brewed in Margaret's mind for days, hesitant and tentative, like the first drops of rain before a storm. Inviting Daniel to her home felt intimate, far more personal than their usual coffee shop chats or casual park walks. Yet the idea wouldn't leave her. She imagined what it would be like to share a space that was truly hers with him, the living room where she read every night, the kitchen where she prepared her modest meals, the garden that had been her quiet retreat for years. Letting him into her world felt both thrilling and terrifying. Margaret stood in her kitchen one morning, absent-mindedly stirring her tea as she rehearsed how she might invite him over. I was thinking, maybe you could come by sometime, she mumbled aloud, then shook her head. Too vague. Too casual. Her reflection in the microwave caught her eye. She gave herself a small, resolute nod. You're overthinking this, she whispered. That afternoon they met for coffee as usual. Daniel was as warm and animated as always, recounting a story about a friend's recent wedding mishap. Margaret found herself laughing freely, but underneath her mind raced. When the conversation hit a lull, she cleared her throat and leaned forward slightly. Daniel, she began, her voice steady despite the nerves knotting her stomach, you've been such a wonderful part of my life lately. I was wondering, would you like to come over for dinner sometime? I'd love to cook for you. For a moment, he looked surprised, and Margaret braced herself for hesitation. But then his face lit up with that boyish grin she had grown so fond of. I'd love that, he said without missing a beat. What's your specialty? She laughed, relieved. Well, I can promise a decent lasagna. The wine might be the real highlight, though. They settled on a date for the weekend. And as they parted ways, Margaret felt a mixture of exhilaration and dread. The invitation was out there now, and he had accepted it. She would need to prepare, not just the dinner but her heart as well. Over the next few days, she threw herself into the details of planning the evening. She tidied the house with a vigor she hadn't felt in years, carefully choosing the candles for the table, the music playlist, even the flowers for the vase on the counter. But as the day approached, doubt began to creep in again. What if this was a mistake? What if he saw her home, her life, and found it uninteresting or too far removed from his own? The night before the dinner, Margaret sat in her garden, the evening breeze cool against her skin. She stared at the stars, searching for reassurance. This is just dinner, she whispered to herself, though she knew it wasn't. It was a chance to see if their connection could be something more, something deeper. And for the first time in a long while, Margaret decided she was ready to take that chance. The doorbell rang with a soft chime that echoed in the stillness of the evening. Margaret's heart fluttered in her chest as she hurried to open it. Standing on her doorstep was Daniel, looking effortlessly charming in a simple navy shirt and jeans, the same easy smile that always made her stomach flip. He held a bottle of wine in one hand, a bouquet of flowers in the other, his gesture so naturally thoughtful it made her heart ache. You brought flowers, she said, her voice betraying her surprise. He smiled, a glint of mischief in his eyes. I thought I'd add a little color to the night. Margaret stepped aside to let him in, feeling an almost dizzying mix of excitement and vulnerability. As he entered, the scent of garlic and rosemary filled the air from the kitchen, and Margaret felt a flicker of pride. She had made everything herself, from scratch. The lasagna was bubbling in the oven, the wine chilling in the corner. She had never felt so eager for a meal to be perfect. They settled at the dining table, the warm light of candles flickering in the quiet space between them. Conversation flowed easily, as it always did with Daniel. They talked about books, music, and the oddities of life that seemed to connect them in such unexpected ways. She listened to him speak, her attention captured by the way he animated each story, the laugh that escaped him when he made a joke. It was easy to forget the age gap between them, easy to forget that their worlds should have been too different to merge. But then, as he leaned across the table to refill her glass, his fingers brushed hers, and a subtle spark shot through her. The touch, brief as it was, sent a ripple of warmth through her body, making her acutely aware of the space between them. She had thought, in the quiet moments before the dinner, that it would be an evening of simple companionship. But now, with him so close, she realized it was something else entirely. "You're quiet," he said, his voice soft as he caught her staring at him, her thoughts caught in a tangled mess of emotions. She smiled, trying to mask the surge of feelings that threatened to overwhelm her. "Just thinking how lucky I am to have someone like you in my life." It was true, but it also felt like too much. Daniel paused, looking at her as if searching for something deeper in her words. "I feel the same way," he said, his voice suddenly hushed, almost tender. "I've never had a friendship like this, Margaret. It's more than I expected." Margaret felt her pulse quicken. The intensity in his eyes, the sincerity in his voice, she had felt it too. The line between friendship and something more was becoming increasingly difficult to ignore, and she wasn't sure how to navigate it without losing the easy comfort they had built. The evening stretched on, the wine flowing as freely as the conversation. But now, there was a deeper undercurrent between them. She could feel it in the way his eyes lingered just a little longer when they met. She could feel it in the brush of his hand against her arm when he passed her the bread basket. And when the evening drew to a close and he stood to leave, there was a lingering moment, a pause in the air where neither of them moved. "Thank you for tonight," he said softly. "I didn't expect this to feel so right." Margaret smiled, her heart both full and heavy at once. "Neither did I." As he stepped out into the night, Margaret lingered at the door, the warmth of the evening still in her bones. She closed the door quietly behind her and leaned against it, her thoughts a whirlwind of new emotions she didn't quite know how to hold on to. The connection was undeniable now, and though the uncertainty about where it would lead still lingered, Margaret couldn't deny the sense of peace that settled over her. Perhaps this was the beginning of something she had only dared to dream about. As the days passed, Margaret found herself returning to the evening Daniel had visited her, replaying the moments over and over in her mind. There was a certain sweetness to their interactions, something tender yet raw, as if both of them were quietly acknowledging the unspoken truth that had been building between them. But with that sweetness came an undeniable ache, a question that loomed larger with every passing thought. What did this all mean? She had lived a full life, one filled with its own joys, its own disappointments. She'd seen the ebb and flow of love, the early excitement of new beginnings, the slow unraveling of old bonds. And yet, with Daniel, something felt different. Her feelings for him were not simply born out of the loneliness that had often defined her existence. They were something more, an awakening, a rediscovery of parts of herself she had long forgotten. Her capacity for passion, for curiosity, for desire. Margaret had always been the one who took care of others, the one who gave. Her life had been a string of responsibilities, raising children, maintaining friendships, caring for aging parents, and in the process, she had forgotten how to give to herself. She had become, over the years, a woman who had settled into quiet contentment, content with her books, her garden, the simplicity of her routines. There was nothing wrong with that life, but it was predictable, safe. But then Daniel had entered, and suddenly, life had become uncertain. His youth, his energy, his exuberance, it was all so raw, so unapologetic. And her own emotions, which she had tucked away so neatly, had resurfaced with a force that both thrilled and terrified her. What would people think? The question weighed heavily on her mind. The difference in their ages was not insignificant. And though Margaret had never been one to care deeply about societal expectations, the idea of judgment still gnawed at her. Would they see her as desperate, foolish, as a woman who had missed her time? But as she sat in her sunroom one afternoon, a cup of tea in her hands, Margaret realized something that changed everything. She wasn't afraid of what others might think, not anymore. She wasn't the same woman she had been when she was younger, bound by the need for validation or approval. No, this was something else entirely. This was about her own heart, her own desire, and the truth that love in all its forms had no expiration date. Her heart fluttered at the thought. The freedom she felt in allowing herself to love, to feel, was so new to her, it was almost overwhelming. She no longer needed to hide behind walls of self-doubt or societal judgment. If love had found her again, albeit in an unexpected form, then who was she to refuse it? Margaret smiled to herself, the weight of her thoughts lifting. She had been afraid for so long to embrace the things that had been waiting patiently inside her. Now, for the first time, she understood that love wasn't bound by age or circumstance. It wasn't a question of when or why, it simply was. And she would let it unfold as it would, without fear. As she set down her cup and gazed out the window at the garden she had so carefully tended, Margaret felt something that had long eluded her, a sense of peace. She was ready to take whatever came next, ready to explore the connection she had with Daniel, and ready to embrace the adventure of love, no matter where it led as the weeks passed. Margaret found herself more alive than she had in years. There was a joy in her heart that had been dormant, a spark she hadn't even realized had gone out until Daniel reignited it. Their moments together were no longer just a series of shared cups of tea or conversations that lingered until the sun began to set. They were now something deeper, something more profound. She had stepped into a new chapter of her life, one filled with possibility. She had spent years doubting herself, wondering if she had missed her chance at true love, telling herself that it was too late for her to seek anything more than quiet contentment. But Daniel had shown her something beautiful, that love, in its many forms, did not have an expiration date. The heart, after all, was never too old to beat with desire. Her capacity to love was not bound by the years that had passed or the choices she had made. It was simply part of who she was, ageless and ever-present. That evening, as Margaret and Daniel walked through the park hand in hand, the cool autumn air wrapping around them, she reflected on how far she had come. She no longer saw herself as a woman defined by the expectations of others, nor did she fear judgment. The love they shared was something only they understood, a love that defied the conventional measures of time and age. Margaret looked over at Daniel, his face illuminated by the glow of the streetlights. She smiled to herself, filled with a quiet sense of gratitude. This was hers, this love, this connection, this new beginning. "Are you happy?" Daniel asked, his voice gentle but steady, as though he already knew the answer. Margaret stopped, turning to face him. She reached out, taking his hands in hers. She met his eyes, seeing the sincerity there, the warmth that mirrored her own. It was the look of someone who had found something precious and was no longer afraid to hold on to it. "I am," she said, her voice strong, her heart full. "I never thought I would feel this way again, but I do. And it feels like the most natural thing in the world." And in that moment, Margaret understood. Love was not about timing. It wasn't about the past or the future. It was about the now. It was about recognizing the beauty in the connections we make, the moments we share, and the willingness to embrace what life brings, no matter when it arrives. She leaned in, kissed him softly on the lips, and in the stillness of the night, she whispered, "I'm not giving up today. Not ever." For Margaret, this was just the beginning, and in her heart, she knew that love in all its forms would continue to surprise her, to guide her, and to remind her that no matter our age, our hearts still have room to love again.